Molecular. Thank you, Tech. But this one is specifically centered around how to talk about MHS. So we've had a lot of conversations thus far, a lot of trainings around molecular HIV surveillance, some teach backs, some conversations. But a lot of the questions that we received, especially in our state lead space, is like, how do we go out into community and have these conversations with community members who may not be aware that this is taking place? So we went back to the table, to the drawing board, with our policy team, our programs team, and a few other folks, and tried to figure out ways that we can start to have these conversations within our community, in ways that our community folks can understand, like in ways that makes the most sense. So we have a wonderful panel today, and I will be moderating and facilitating. We have Kelly, who is in the background working in tech. So if you all have any questions, you can use the chat. You can raise your hand if you need us to like slow down and possibly repeat something. We can do that. We are trying to move at the pace of community, so that we all are understanding this information and having a conversation versus a training or a teaching. So, next slide. I didn't even introduce myself. A lot of y'all know me. My name is Antoinette. I'm the National Field Organizer at PWN. Um, and this is our logistics. We're going to get into introducing who's going to be on the panel in a little bit. So this is being recorded for, hopefully we can post it on our YouTube so that folks can go back and watch this video, as well as our state lead program, which is specifically working on organizing around MHS in their communities. Closed captioning is enabled, so if you need it, please use it. Ask questions by raising your hand in the chat. We're in meeting mode on Zoom, so like I said, you can mute, unmute, raise your hand. If you're on your phone, all you got to do is press *6 to unmute yourself. Sorry, she wants me to take off her shoes. So next slide. As I said, I'm Antoinette Jones, the National Field Organizer at PWN. I specifically work with our chapters, our members, and our state leads. And then next slide. And here is our wonderful panel today. So we have Amir, who works at CHLP, the Center for HIV Law and Policy. Amir is the Policy and Advocacy Manager, and we're so delighted that Amir is able to join us to provide insight on this topic. We have Barb Cardell, who you all know is our Program Director at Positive Women's Network and an MHS super person. We always go to Barb for insight about MHS. And then we have our lovely state lead from Maryland and so much more, Melanie Reese, who is also, I consider also an expert in MHS and very knowledgeable in the way that she talks about MHS, but you all will get to hear from these panelists in a few. Next slide. So our agenda, welcome and grounding, which we just did. You all can also introduce yourselves in the chat, share your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from. We're going to dive into how to talk about MHS, just a quick guide. We have a few slides that pretty much center this, which I will be sharing. Like one slide, we have a little poll where we're going to ask you all a question, and then Amir will take it over with some more slides from CHLP. Facilitated conversation, which is with our panel, as well as some next steps. Our goals and objectives for when we leave the space. So by the time we are finished, we hope and expect that participants will feel more comfortable talking about MHS, especially using the how to talk about MHS guide, understanding the basic issues, concerns, and pushback that may come up when we are talking about MHS. It happens all the time, and we just are trying to prepare you for when it does happen, you know how to combat some of the pushback you may receive. And then hear from people living with HIV, our leaders in the community, about how they have talked about MHS in their spaces. with community as well as people in decision-making power. Next slide. And I see folks are dropping their names and their pronouns in the chat. Thank y'all. So happy that y'all can join us. So Positive Women's Network. So if you are not a member of Positive Women's Network, and you may not have seen these slides before, but we are the only national membership created and for women living with HIV, transgender and cisgender women, gender diverse and non-conforming, as well as transgender people living with HIV. Since 2008, our members have created a unified voice and built collective power for women, transgender and cisgender, gender non-conforming, gender diverse, all of the things, trans folks. And we believe that racial and gender justice cannot be devastated, from the HIV response and our groundwork in collective liberation. PWN is creating a world where all women and trans folks can live long, healthy, and dignified lives free from stigma, discrimination, and criminalization, which we see show up in our conversations around MHS. So why we are here, why we are all in this space, is of course to talk about MHS. Y'all have seen folks walk around with these awesome t-shirts that says humans, not clusters.
Barbara's wearing it.
Barbara's wearing it. Barbara's rocking the shirt. I need to put in an order for my shirt right now. But molecular HIV surveillance supporters have said that they are looking into molecules and not people. But molecules are connected to people, and people are situated in social contexts. So when I think about this, I think about, like, where are y'all looking? Are y'all looking in underserved areas? Are y'all looking at predominantly Black areas? Where and who are y'all targeting when you want this information, when our data and our molecules are being surveilled? So when we get into MHS more deeply, but just start to have the conversation on why it matters, MHS becomes a requirement for people for HIV prevention. And it became a requirement for HIV prevention in 2018. So it was rolled out without our input and has been a big controversial issue ever since. My primary controversy with MHS is the consent piece, which is completely missing from this whole process. It was like as if it was skipped over. So people living with HIV rarely know, and we have encountered this very often, that our HIV genetic data is being stored in databases, and or that anyone outside of our doctors or our providers will have access to it. So without informed consent, this fuels a mistrust, which already takes place, especially in marginalized communities, between public health and people living with HIV, especially Black, Indigenous people of color, especially queer folks and trans folks within our communities. MHS does not happen exclusively in laboratories or databases or in research settings. It happens within the context of power, people who have decision-making power in leadership, in politics and policies that have already stigmatized, targeted, and criminalized communities most impacted by HIV. The CDC, the health departments, all of these folks, they don't want to talk about MHS. They don't want us talking about MHS or even asking questions about MHS. They get very defensive when we start to bring it up in their spaces that they invite us to. But it's important that we still do so and that we continue to do so, because we should hold them accountable for this program that they implemented that does not include the voices of community. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand it over to Amir. You can take the floor and just go ahead and guide us through.
Thank you so much. I just, it's so great to be here. If you, I see a lot of familiar faces joining today, and if you know me, you know I really love PWN USA, and you might know that I've been throwing down with PWN New York chapter on some harmful HIV policy issues here in New York that actually I think, really intersect with this conversation about consent and bodily autonomy in really important ways. So I'm really happy to be here to be walking through the guide on how to talk about molecular HIV surveillance and these intersections of criminalization, bodily autonomy, and the risks for people living with HIV. And I loved what you said, Antoinette, about, you know, molecular HIV surveillance happens in the context of power. I couldn't have said it any better myself. And you know what? This conversation's all about, you know what else exists in the context of power? We do, and people living with HIV do. And we get to make power and build power and take power. And that's what this conversation is really about. So I'm really excited to talk with you all today. My name's Amir. I use he, him pronouns. My email's on the screen here. And I can also type it into the chat a little bit later. So if we could just move to
Amir,
the,
I'm so
yes.
sorry to cut you off real quick. Kelly, we had a poll. Did you want to do the poll real quick before Amir goes on?
Oh, is that okay, Amir? Can we launch the poll real quick? Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Thanks
absolutely.
for remembering. All right, let's go ahead and launch this poll. This is why we have multiple people on these webinars, to remind us when we forget things. All right, folks, so we created just a quick poll to hear about what you've already talked about around MHS. We just want to see kind of like who's in the room. And so, the first question is, have you talked about MHS with someone before? Yes, all the time. Yes, not that often. Not at all. No wrong answers. We're just trying to hear about who's here. And then, how comfortable are you talking about MHS? Very, kind of, not at all. Maybe you haven't done it, so you don't know yet. So yeah, just take a couple of seconds, fill in the poll so that we can see kind of who's in the room. And actually, it's, wow, very, lots of different answers. This is wonderful to see. All right, I am seeing the poll getting filled in, and it looks like everyone has answered. Wow, y'all are quick. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. And I'm going to share the results. So we have a shockingly even split on all of these questions, which I don't know how that happens, but I love it. It shows the diversity of experience in the room. So 35% talk about MHS all the time, 38% do, but not that often, and 27% haven't talked about MHS before. So we do have some folks who are newer to this conversation. Welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. And then, how comfortable do you feel talking about MHS? We have 21% very comfortable, 33% is kind of comfortable, 33% is not very comfortable, and 13% don't know. They haven't done it before. So this is really, really exciting. I think you all are in the exact right place to really dig into this conversation around how we talk about MHS, how we deal with pushback when it happens. So with that, Amir, I'm going to toss it over to you to actually walk us through the guide.
Thank you, Kelly. That is very interesting. Those are very interesting survey results. So that was great. So yeah, I just dropped my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me about any questions. If you want to take a look at these slides or you want to talk more, I'd be so happy to do that. So if we could go to the next slide, just a little info. If you're unfamiliar with CHLP, we're an abolitionist legal and policy organization fighting to end stigma, discrimination, and violence at the intersection of HIV, race, health status, disability, class, sexual and gender identity, and expression, with a focus on criminal and public health systems. So we've been working together with the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, with PWN USA, with other networks of people living with HIV across the country to mobilize and combat against, as Antoinette said, this deeply controversial public health practice, really ever since the beginning, since states were forced to do it. So if we could go to the next slide. And since, I know this is the third in a 4-part series, and you've already, if you've been following along, there's the first part of this 4-part series really dug into what MHS is. So I won't really spend time here. I'm really looking forward to actually the panel discussion as well. So, just as a recap, if it is helpful, this might be a good way to visualize how molecular HIV surveillance happens, how MHS happens. as it was mentioned earlier, it became a requirement for federal HIV prevention funding. All states in the country are required to do this. And it was these decisions were made without the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV or networks of people living with HIV at all. So, you know, this is just a little bit of an overview about how it happens. And the next slide, you know, gets into like the brief explanation, which we're going to be talking about, right? What we're here talking about is how to talk about molecular HIV surveillance. And in short, it's the public health use of an individual's HIV genetic data to map the sexual and social networks of people living with HIV. And it happens without requirements around informed consent, without the knowledge of people living with HIV. And CDC and state health departments store and collect and analyze and report this kind of data to track networks of HIV transmission. So next slide. So really what we're here to do today is walk through this guide. It's a guide on how to talk about molecular HIV surveillance. There is a link right here on this slide to the guide, but I can also drop it in the chat very quickly right here. So if you'd like to follow along through the guide as we're going through this presentation, please feel free to do so. So next slide. Thank you. And thank you for advancing these slides for me. And I also like to start this by a grounding too. What grounds our advocacy? What are the values that we bring and center in this work? Number one, MIPA, the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS. Number two, that public health cannot work. It doesn't work without people's trust. And trust is not something like a problem that public health professionals and clinicians have to solve. Trust has to be earned, right? That's how trust works in our personal lives, in our professional lives. Trust has to be earned. Number three, informed consent and bodily autonomy aren't just best practices for public health. They are fundamental human rights. And they're fundamental human rights that a lot of us know go back to in the tradition of HIV activism from the early days. So these are important values, I think, for us that ground our advocacy. And finally, policing and criminalization have no place in public health. Next slide. So, and if you're following along on our guide for advocates, you might see near the top, or it might be on the second page actually. What we want to talk about first is having an explanation of what MHS is. And, you know, the reason that PWN USA and the US People Living with HIV Caucus and CHLP got together to make this guide that we're talking about today is talking about MHS is hard. It's difficult. You know, some of you could see in the survey results, maybe you haven't talked about it yet because the complicated jargon and the science makes you feel uncomfortable talking about MHS. And that kind of disempowering dynamic is almost, it's by design, right? They use these convoluted terms to make it harder to talk about it and disempower a community. So what I think is helpful to start from is just having an understanding of the needs of your audience when you're talking about MHS. Are you speaking with somebody who's a fellow person living with HIV who really understands these complicated legacies of dehumanizing policy and anti-Blackness and misogynoir and misogyny? You know, are you talking with someone who really understands those dynamics, or are you talking maybe with a medical provider, a clinician who doesn't really have that kind of grounding? And I think our explanation of MHS might look a little bit different depending on who we're speaking with. You know, if we're talking with our neighbors and our family members about MHS, we might prioritize certain issues in that conversation when we talk with a medical provider or public health officials, we might prioritize a different framework. And, you know, I can just add a personal example that an observation I've made personally when I talk about MHS with clinicians and medical providers, I've found it to be extremely helpful to really hammer on the issue of trust, on trust, on medical mistrust, on the legacies of medical racism and discrimination that so many people living with HIV and people affected by HIV experience accessing care every day of their lives. And that the influence of those experiences on trust and the influence of molecular HIV surveillance on trust, I found to be really useful to center in a conversation with a medical provider. So that just might give you a sense of how we might change how we talk about MHS depending on who we're speaking with. Because I guess the quiet part out loud right now is what I've found is when I talk about bodily autonomy and informed consent with medical providers, I see it shutting down. And that's a huge problem, right? I'm excited to kind of interrogate and deal with that problem of why medical providers just shut down when we talk about those issues. But trust is something that I've found is an important issue that they do resonate with. So yeah, we talked about that complicated science makes it hard to talk about MHS. So let's use our own language. Genotyping, genotypic data, phenotypic. We don't have to use these terms. And we shouldn't. We should use our own language, which kind of extends to this final point here that we want to be mindful of stigmatizing language, right? This whole series, the Barb shirt, is referencing the dehumanizing and harmful language that federal HIV policymakers use. So we don't have to use that language either, unless we're playing with it with that wonderful graphic shirt, because I do love that. Next slide. So when thinking about like just having an explanation ready, and before I go any further, since I talk about ending the HIV epidemic in this like explanation of MHS, I want to take a moment and acknowledge that I joined today's Still Demanding Better webinar put together by the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. And I just want to say that everything everyone said today about the framework of ending the HIV epidemic is extremely limited and not meaningfully responding to the needs of people living with HIV and aging people living with HIV. That all resonates with me, and I'm in a complete alignment with those concerns. So this, I do have that framework here in this explanation of MHS, but I did just want to share that I couldn't agree more with that assessment from the caucus and in that discussion that I think a lot of you might have also joined in on today too. But let's say, it's kind of like the elevator pitch. You catch somebody and you want to talk to them about MHS. Hey, I want state and federal agencies to work together to end the HIV epidemic, but the controversial use of medical data to map the networks of people living with HIV is dangerous. I see, when we talk about it in these terms, we're not using CDC's language. We're not using complicated jargon, and I think we're explaining it in a way that we're hoping to get a response from the person we're talking to, and it might prompt questions. What's MHS? This goes back to kind of that brief description I had in an earlier slide. The public health use of individual genetic data. It's public health use of individual data that's created at the point of direct care for a person living with HIV, but is used for public health purposes outside of that direct scope of medical care, right? To identify sexual and social networks of people living with HIV without their knowledge or consent, which, if we go to the next slide, hopefully by now, the person that you're speaking with is interested and concerned too, right? Is alarmed. And we can add a few of these other things when we're talking about MHS that, right? Hey, did you know that this genetic data is shared without the knowledge or consent of people living with HIV? Did you know, or you probably know in this conversation you're having, like, hey, did you know, hey, people living with HIV experience medical racism and discrimination every day. And that fuels mistrust of our medical and public health system. And I like this one, right? That the CDC, and Antoinette references, forced states to do this without any consideration for the rights of people living with HIV or any consideration on how data can be used against people living with HIV. So hopefully now we have a sense of how to describe, how to talk about MHS in these terms, or protections for that data. That's definitely one of the main issues that the guide digs into. So if we could go to the next slide, and I'm sorry if I'm going fast. I just really I'm excited for the panel discussion for this to be more of an open discussion. So, the advocacy guide breaks down some issues, and that first issue is consent. And the other thing that I want to give a shout out here too is if you're following along with the guide, it has some questions designed to ask your health department when you're talking with them or your medical provider. So please feel free to look at those questions and think about them and think about asking them next time you go to a HIV planning group meeting or next time you engage with your state or local health department. But this issue of consent is one of the major ones, right? We're talking about genetic data that's being used outside the scope of your direct medical care without your knowledge or consent, and you have no say in how it's used. This is, and public health is most effective when we center the human dignity and fundamental rights of people living with HIV, right? And I think all of us are aware of the historic legacy of dehumanizing HIV policy, both globally and here in the United States. So this helps fit MHS, hopefully, in the person that you're speaking with, into this longer tradition, this longer legacy and history of undermining the rights of people living with HIV for some abstract public health goal, right? This issue of consent also raises, what I think PWN state leads what I've heard that there's been questions about, what I've heard questions in my own experiences too, is like, hey, if we tell patients, they won't opt in to molecular HIV surveillance. And I think, first of all, that is a deeply patronizing and condescending way to respond to a question about the rights of a deeply marginalized community of people who are literally asking a question of, hey, shouldn't I have a say-so about how my data is used? So, and I always just wonder where that energy is around criminalization, right? We know HIV criminalization is a huge barrier to HIV testing and treatment and care. And I kind of wish providers and public health folks were brought a little bit of that same energy to that conversation, rather than telling people, well, if we are more transparent about what we're doing with data, people won't opt in. I mean, really, at the end of the day, shouldn't people have a say in how their data is used? Next slide. So the next issue that the guide deals with is this comparison, right? You're going to hear this in conversations probably with public health folks, that molecular HIV surveillance is just like the molecular surveillance of foodborne illnesses. You have nothing to worry about. We have to stop this comparison in its tracks, right? There is no meaningful comparison between molecular HIV surveillance and the molecular surveillance of foodborne illnesses. That isn't an offensive comparison that we are demanding public health folks to stop making, right? Because, and this was something, brought up in that earlier conversation today, still demanding better. The HIV epidemic is a byproduct of generations of racism, anti-Blackness, homophobia, transphobia, discrimination in our health and public health systems. This is where the HIV epidemic finds life, in these legacies, in these harmful, dehumanizing legacies. So we just cannot compare the two. I mean, HIV transmissions occur most likely through condomless sex, through sharing injectable devices in the practice of injecting drugs. You can't compare that, right? These are poorly understood, stigmatized, and criminalized actions, and you cannot compare that, right, at all. We need to stop public health people making that comparison. And the advocacy guide talks a little bit more about, and hopefully gives you the tools that you need to stop that comparison. Next slide. The guide also talks about the weaponization of data against people living with HIV. When we talk about MHS, we should be linking it to HIV criminalization, and we should be reminding folks, especially people on the medical and public health side, that HIV arrests and prosecutions are not rare. I mean, I find in conversations with some medical professionals, they don't have really a grounding or an understanding about how prevalent HIV arrests and prosecutions are. They might think it's dozens. It's not. It's thousands, right? We know thousands of people living with HIV have made contact with the criminal legal system because of their HIV diagnosis. So we hopefully should be connecting MHS with HIV criminalization. Over 30 states have a variation of a HIV criminal law on the books. Many use general crimes like reckless endangerment, aggravated assault, attempted murder. State laws that protect the confidentiality of your HIV medical information widely permit the release of your HIV testing related information to courts and prosecutors. And, you know, this could be a question that you ask when you're having a conversation with someone about MHS. Like, shouldn't this have been thought out and addressed before the CDC decided to force states to do this? Next slide, please. And the risk of your HIV testing related information being used against you in a criminal prosecution is not rare. It's not hypothetical. It's the reality right now. And this is a resource created by NASTAD, the US HIV Data Protection Landscape. There's a link there on the slide that you can access the full tool. This is just, you know, the states shaded in blue here are states that will explicitly allow a health department to release HIV data to law enforcement, courts, and prosecutors. But I have a sobering, you know, point to make here about this map, because even the states not shaded here are also implicated by the access of your medical information in the use of a criminal prosecution. Because what this resource highlights is state laws that explicitly address how confidentiality protections extend to law enforcement access and use. But there are many states' laws that don't explicitly address whether its laws protecting the confidentiality of your information extend to whether law enforcement can use it and access it against you. Just case in point, you can see Mississippi here, not shaded in blue. That's not because Mississippi has an explicit law protecting HIV information from the use in a criminal prosecution. It's just not shaded blue because the state doesn't have an explicit law that addresses this. So it's actually potentially many, many more states. And if we go to the next slide, of those first states that were shaded in blue, these states don't even require a court order for information to be released, right? So these are states, many of these states, a lot of you know, have horrific stigmatizing felony laws targeting and punishing people living with HIV. So this is the reality right now. And I think there's some level setting that has to happen with people in public health when we talk about this. Next slide. And, you know, I talked about this a little bit already, and I feel like I've been taking up so much time already. But as I mentioned a moment ago, yeah, you know, what you'll hear from folks who might be pushing back against your real lived experience and your real lived expertise and concerns about MHS, you might hear, well, hey, don't worry, states have laws protecting the confidentiality of HIV medical information. That's true, except most states, they generally have exceptions to those protections. And they generally have pretty huge exceptions, especially in response to a court order or a subpoena, or some states are even forced to cooperate in criminal prosecutions against people living with HIV. State health departments, I should say, are forced to cooperate. Next slide. Maybe I'll skip over this slide because we can talk about this during the panel discussion, but I do want to try to go through these main issues so we can save time for the panel discussion. But one of the next issue in the advocacy guide is that CDC data privacy guidelines don't really do a whole lot, right? They're currently updating the 2011 data guidelines, but that means we need to keep pushing for more. We need to keep putting pressure and keep having this conversation. Federal HIV data privacy guidelines are poked full of holes, but the deeper issue is that they can't control US state law. And that's where the problem is, right? We just saw an example of states that permit and authorize the release of your HIV information and potentially to be used against you in a criminal prosecution. And CDC data privacy guidelines can't touch that. So that's the deeper issue here. Washington, D.C. passed a more significant HIV data protection, and something that we could be talking about more when we talk about HIV, molecular HIV surveillance, is CDC should give incentives so states can follow DC's lead. And I think hopefully the next slide is the last slide. The last issue in the advocacy guide, understanding medical mistrust. Right? This is I think the Achilles heel for people who defend molecular HIV surveillance. Because I think in a lot of our experiences, we've noticed they just have no response to this, right? There's nothing that they can say, because this is a very legitimate response and concern that people living with HIV have when they hear about what MHS is, how their data is used without their consent. So I think it's something we should really keep returning to. I'm excited to talk more about this during the panel discussion, and really something when we're talking about this issue of medical mistrust. I mean, think about it this, right? Rather than combat legacies of medical racism and mistrust, the CDC is welcoming and encouraging the collection of data without the consent of people living with HIV, right? That is an accurate account of what's happening amongst our federal HIV policy partners, and we have to speak truth to this. And with that, yeah, I think these are the main issues that we talk about in the advocacy guide. I'm so happy to stick around to the kind of Q&A and discussion portion. I think that's it for me. Yeah, this is just the closing slide.
Thank you so much, Amir. This was very, very powerful. What took me out was the two slides comparing the states that allow health departments to release HIV data to law enforcement, and then like the second slide that was like, of those states, these don't even require a court order for these data to be released. That was very shocking to me because I did not know that. So thank you for those slides. Now we're going to get into our panel discussion, y'all. We have a few questions and a few mock, I guess not an interview, but I can't find my words now. But if you all can drop questions in the chat, because the questions we ask don't even get to, they cover a lot, but they don't really get deep into what I've been hearing in community as far as the answers that folks want to know. Now's the time, y'all. We have experts on this panel. Don't be shy. Ask the questions that you have been pressing and wanting to hear answers to thus far into our MHS series. So, Kelly, if you can, they're already spotlighted. Wonderful. So, hey, Melanie, hey, Barb, and hey, Amir again. So, our first question is for all of you all. And it's, what gets you fired up when we are talking about MHS? And I'll start with Melanie.
What gets me fired up talking about molecular HIV surveillance is my consent, and other people living with HIV do not consent to have this information shared and then stored. When you ask them, why do they do that? This is a tool to end the HIV epidemic. And I said, what? How can you get to the end of epidemic if people find out that this is happening? They're not going to get tested. They're not going to stay in care. It's going to demolish the framework for ending the HIV epidemic. And the CDC, because I talked to the CDC, Dr. Fauci, I talked to Dr. Redfield, who was the head, and they had no response. None. Number one, they didn't expect anybody to push back or ask a question because they're used to putting something out and that's it. So that's what gets me fired up.
Thank you, Melanie. I love that you raised a good point as far as people advertently falling out of care if this was, discussed more. Like, that could be a possibility of something that could happen because of the already existing um, mistrust with the healthcare system. So it's kind of like, I trusted you for all this time, and now you're telling me that my data is being tracked. So it could have a ripple effect is kind of what I heard. So thank you. Barb, you're next on my screen. What gets you fired up about MHS?
Yeah, when we talk about MHS, I am deeply offended by this program in every way, shape, or form, deeply offended, because it is almost saying like people living with HIV are so dangerous that we need to be tracked in this way where we're not informed, where we were not a part of the planning when this initiative came about, when they started talking about using our data in this way for research. People living with HIV were not a part of the conversation. This is like anti-MIPA. We were not meaningfully involved. It is everything that's MIPA, this is not. We were not informed about it when we started asking questions. First off, they were horrified that we knew, which is, again, when we talk about medical mistrust and we talk about why, when we push back and we say that advocates need to be involved in every piece of our care and our access to services and programs and funding, this is exactly why, because they want us to sit down, they want us to shut up, they want us to not even know about it so that they can track us. We are not cantaloupes. We are not a foodborne illness. We must be able to determine how our information is being used. And I go back to the original source of this data. It comes from an appointment that I had with my care provider to make a decision about my medical care. No one should be involved in that. No one should have access to that. And that pisses me off so much. So yeah, I started thinking about it and it just is beyond. It's just beyond. And I'll go ahead and pass back to you, Antoinette.
Thank you, Barb. I love that you mentioned how horrified they were when we found out, because they were so celebratory. Like, look at our new program, MHS. Look at our results. And we're like, hold the hell up. Mm-hmm. How did you get this information without our consent? How do we get from A to Z? And at no point did you say, let's involve people living with HIV in the process. So thank you for raising that. Amir, I would love to hear what gets you fired up about MHS.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what gets me fired up amongst the issues that were already raised, because those definitely kept me fired up, the anti-MIPA dynamic here. I think what gets me fired up beyond that is public health is supposed to be about protecting communities. And you can't protect communities when you destroy their trust, when you have been sitting on your hands, allowing and permitting criminalization to happen on your watch, when you've been, right, people living with HIV are not just singled out and criminalized because of their HIV status. They're criminalized because they're accessing gender affirming care. They're criminalized because of because we criminalize substance use. They're criminalized because we criminalize homelessness. They're criminalized because we criminalize Blackness in this country. So, you know, I think the lack of a public health, you know, response, or that public health's really lack of an interest in responding to these legacies of criminalization, state violence, and discrimination gets me fired up, because rather than focus on a shiny toy and this cool new tool that you have to monitor and track the sexual and social networks of people living with HIV, we should be doing more for people living with HIV. And surveillance is always a symptom of a failure, right? If they have to do surveillance, it means they failed, and we should be demanding more. Just really in alignment with the conversation from earlier today, we should be demanding better.
Definitely. Thank you. You're spot on. I love seeing raised hands. I love seeing raised hands. So, Brielle, I'm going to actually pop it to you to go ahead and hop in and mix us up a little bit.
When I first found out about this, I found it to be at the utmost disrespectful. And then for my physician to know that this is going on, and me to put my trust in you this long, and you to know that this is going on, you not consulted in with me, it makes me not even want to be in care. And even though I know it would harm me, but being in care, I feel like I'm just being continually labeled as a statistic, and tracked like I'm an animal that's at the end of the line or something. Like, I don't respect it at all. And if it applies to one, it applies to all. Confidentiality. Ain't no ways around that. You got to get our consent. Not for some, but for everything. You have to, and they're not doing that, and they making excuses on it when it comes to them breaking the law. And at the end of the day, they forget that they work for us, not we work for them.
Brielle, you are spot on. I think my physician hates that I know so much, or that I be going back and forth with him, because when I brought up MHS at my last appointment, he was like, I knew this would come up sooner or later. I said, so why didn't you bring it up, and you waited on me to bring it up? So that just shows how much, exactly what you said. Like, I trusted you, and how am I supposed to continue to trust you when you're withholding information? So thank you for that. Melanie, I'm actually going to ask you this question. So I want you to tell us, when you first started talking about MHS, was it hard? Was it easy? Or was it somewhere in between, because of how passionate you are about advocating for people living with HIV?
When I first found out about molecular HIV surveillance, I was angry. My head just wanted to just pop off my body. I could not believe what I was reading. And it was not hard for me to push back, ask questions, and I don't stop at one question. When they think, oh, I'll answer this. It's like the 5 whys. Why? Just keep asking until you get the answer that's appropriate for you. And so it was not hard. And I have a long history of being a rebel, revolutionary. I'm working on being an abolitionist. So hey, nothing nothing stops me from asking questions and clapping back, talking back, and demanding answers.
Thank you for the clap back. I do see Valerie's hand, so I'm gonna pop it to Valerie, and then we're gonna get into our other discussion questions and topics.
Okay, hello everybody. Uh, I just wanted to, mwah. I just wanted to let y'all know I really appreciate this because I had no clue. This is my first time hearing about it right today at this moment. So yes, I got a lot of questions too, Melanie, now because it's like I'm flabbergasted. I didn't know this. I didn't know that they was doing surveillance on us like that. So yeah, I thank y'all, the panelists. I thank you all so much.
I was going to say the reason most people don't realize this is happening is because it's your regular labs that you want to know how you are doing for yourself, not to be put on a graph
Right,
somewhere.
right,
But it's
okay.
using those vials of blood taken that they do this extra genetic sequencing on. It's you don't go and get a separate test. It's your regular test, and that
Well, yeah. Melanie, can I just hop in because Wanda had a similar question about them using leftover blood. So a genotype is a specific test that your doctor orders. And so it's not something that's done on the sneaky and people don't know about it. If you go and you look at the tests that are ordered, they will order a genotype. So it's a specific test. It's not something that they do on the you know, sneaky that we don't know about. So just wanted to clarify that before
right,
it
but
got confused.
most people don't know what tests their doctors are ordering for them. That's to me the sneaky part.
Absolutely.
And they don't say, well, we're going to get this test because we need to make sure that this medication is going to work for you. They don't do any of that explaining. So,
And they certainly don't say, right? And you brought this point up already. They certainly don't say, oh, and we're going to do this genotype. And by the way, we're going to look at the genetic fingerprint of your HIV and we're going to report it to the state health department, who's then going to report it to the CDC. That's what they should. If they were being really, really partners with us, that's what they would say. And then you would say, oh, I don't think I need that test, right? That's what they would say, and that's what they're afraid of. Sorry. It's okay to be pissed. I'm seeing a lot of people who are sort of having a lot of energy, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it is okay to be pissed about this because it is really, really problematic.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you, Melanie. And I see folks are raising their hands. I would love if it's a question, please put it in the chat because I want to make sure that we get to everything. And then at the end, we will have time for folks to make statements, comments, questions, even more. But I did see Kelly. Kelly, if you want to unmute and ask your question or your statement.
Yeah, mine was a statement. Basically, it was I've done as far as the prison and the criminalization. I did 5 years on an 8-year sentence on a he said, she said. I told him I went through 3 major surgeries. Being with him, we lived together, we were engaged. He said I didn't tell him, and I did. He knew. He picked up my medication with I did not know at the time that at our doctor's office, we can have our partners sign papers stating that they know that we are positive, which would also help protect us from the criminalization. If I would have known that, that could have been done and I wouldn't have done any time. I had my left kidney removed and he went through the surgery with me and I still ended up with 8 years in prison.
Kelly, thank you for sharing that and being so vulnerable in this space. I did want to see if Barb or Amir had any response to what Kelly just shared and how that could potentially impact more folks in community.
Yeah, no, I'm also, yes, please. Thank you so much for sharing. I can't imagine. And, you know, I'd heard of states doing almost the opposite, like worst thing, which is when someone is diagnosed with HIV, they would be forced to sign a statement. Their health department would force them to sign a statement that they are aware that now that they're living with HIV, that they can be criminalized. It's almost the opposite. It's not a protection. It's the opposite. And I'd actually heard, I don't know if anyone from Arkansas is here. I think because of Arkansas's relationship, the Arkansas HIV Reform Initiative, in which is the coalition working to end HIV criminalization in Arkansas, was working together with the Arkansas Department of Health to actually get them to stop making these forcing people living with HIV to sign those statements. But I never heard of you know, Kelly, this type of statement. And I think probably my colleagues at CHLP might be more familiar, because my colleagues at CHLP are working on the ground, or they're working with advocates on the ground across the country to end laws that criminalize people living with HIV. And I don't do as much of that work, sadly, anymore, of like working with state level coalitions. But Barb, I'm not sure if you had any thoughts too about that kind of statement.
Well, for me, not a statement specifically, but more so as evidence that this person is aware of your status by bringing them to your doctor's appointment. So you have a third party witness in the space that is like, yeah, I've seen this person show up to the clinic with them, you know, while they are here specifically for HIV. So they know, like it's like an additional protection for yourself by having that person in the space. But you can draft up your own contract. An honorary leader who transitioned last year that I know, Tiffany Morero, had her own contract that she will present to her partners and have them sign as a protection, as a form of protection for herself. So that's definitely possible. Brielle, I do see your hand, but I did, if you can just hold off for a little bit, I want us to go ahead and ask the next question. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So our next question is more so like dialogue. So I'm gonna suggest some feedback that folks receive when they're talking about MHS, whether in community spaces or at like CDC or HRSA or these type of tables. And I want our panelists to respond with their best reaction or response. So this one is for everyone, but I do want to start with Melanie, and it's kind of related to what we heard or seen in the chat. So people living with HIV are facing a lot of other challenges aside from MHS. Housing insecurity, we facing criminalization in some states, loss of community members, partners, so like mental health is a major thing. And living with HIV in general, like violence by living with HIV, from living with HIV, trauma from living with HIV. So why should we care about MHS? Like, why is this so more important than all these other issues that have not been addressed?
I wouldn't say to them it's more important, it's as important. When you say something more important, you kind of like tone down what things they're actually going through, but it's as important, because criminalization, even in states that don't have a criminal statute, will use regular laws to criminalize you. And the fact that you are a woman, and that you're going through these issues, you are already surveilled. You are already putting yourself in a position to be policed. So you need to know about this also, because this can put you in a position where you have to be removed from society, your family, your children. If someone were to prosecute you and then it's followed through, but they need to know it. That's just another thing that they need to know about in their life journey.
Yeah, Melanie, I love that. I love that. And I'm going to actually take it in a little bit of a different kind of direction, which is that for too long, the tendency has been, especially for the CDC, to look at people living with HIV from a biomedical standpoint. We are numbers. We are our genetic code of the virus. We are our CD4. We are our viral load. We are these numbers. We're not seen as people. We're seen as clusters. We're seen as so much that is just de-identifying and dehumanizing us. So that when we talk about molecular HIV surveillance, I talk about it as just being, it's an expensive program that is not proven to actually work improving the lives of people living with HIV or improving any sort of prevention efforts. What we're talking about here under these other challenges, these are quality of life challenges. So what if we were to take the funding from this cluster detection and response and to actually put it into housing? Because we know that housing is healthcare. Put it into actual harm reduction tools that could be used for folks that are really struggling, that could be used for accessing therapy for people. And so when we talk about the quality of life and what goes into our lives, we need to also push back where funding is going to places that are not appropriate and are not lifting us up as whole people, but are only seeing us as this illness. And that to me is where I continue to really sort of say, let's talk about what we need to do to be healthy and to be whole. And we need to also say this is not appropriate use of funding.
I love what Melanie and Barb just mentioned as far as you can advocate for both at the same time. They both can exist at the same time. And by advocating for MHS and advocating for quality of life, reallocation is a form or a way to advocate for that issue. So thank you for that. Amir, when folks are like, sometimes MHS is not important. Like this don't matter for me. This not a priority in my life. I'm worried about all these other things. Like, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And I love the responses Melanie and Barb gave. And, you know, I think to add to that, like, I think about it in the context of struggle, right? And the struggle against criminalization and state violence is the same struggle against public health policies that obliterate the rights of people living with HIV, right? And because I think if it's not, it wouldn't be, I think I wouldn't want to respond, just as Melanie was saying, I wouldn't want to respond to that person and say one issue is more important than the other, right? But because if you're fighting to put a food over your head, I'm sorry, a roof over your head, and struggling against policing and criminalization, of course, these are major issues in your life. But I also think the moment we let people in power think it's acceptable to consider the rights of people living with HIV and bodily autonomy and sexual freedom and all of these rights as an afterthought, that's a scary world we open the door to. So I think we can struggle against these systems together, right? We can talk about MHS in the context of criminalization, in the context of depriving people of their rights. And I actually think approaching that in this framework is really helpful. to think about it in those contexts. Yeah.
Thank you, Amir. I really love that. One thing that I heard Vanita, the icon, mention is like these folks believe that just because we have a HIV diagnosis that we no longer have decision-making power or rights to make decision or the awareness to make decisions about our body. So they have to make decisions for us. Not they need to, but they have to because we can't anymore because we're living with HIV, and that's 100% wrong. And that's what we have to continue to advocate for, of like, no, we can make decisions for ourselves. So thank you all for that. Another suggestion or thing that we hear, and this one is for Amir. So this tool, we need to end HIV, EHE. It helps us. This tool we use is like, it's to end the epidemic. It helps us target resources and spend money in the best way. This is what we hear these folks tell us. But the implication here is that the right of people living with HIV are necessarily sacrificed to public health. So how do we combat those folks when we are in conversations with them and they just tell us like, oh no, it's necessary in order to end the epidemic? Like, if you want to stop transmissions, then this is why we have to do it.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a question, I mean, it's an important question because this is exactly how the people who defend MHS talk about it. This is the exact rhetoric that the CDC uses when they play down concerns. I think the best response to that is Barb already touched on, right? This is not really proven to work. This is not really proven because something, since we're really talking about how to talk about MHS, what I would encourage folks to do when they get that question is let the person with whom you're talking know that public health people are like, some of them are really concerned about this too, and think this is a massive waste of scarce resources and time on state health departments that are already under enormous strain. So betting on a controversial and problematic public health practice that undermines the rights of people living with HIV, that potentially exposes them to harm and criminalization, without really proving that it's been an effective tool, I think these are questions that we should be asking. And, these are questions that networks and people living with HIV have been asking for years. And so far, the CDC has not published any records or data to show information about how successful it is. There are cherry-picked success stories of situations, like one in Atlanta, and I think in Michigan was another state, where they talked about the success of this as an intervention, as a public health intervention. But my question is always, if we do right by the concerns and the rights of people living with HIV, and we do right by making gender affirming care accessible and universalizing access to treatment and testing and care, right? These seem to be a much more proactive response to public health failures than a reactive solution and tool here to analyze data that's actually we're talking about people who've already connected into care because they've undergone a drug resistance test. And what I've heard from some folks in public health, I heard in Louisiana, it takes so long to do this kind of molecular surveillance and analysis that by the time they identify people through this kind of molecular HIV surveillance, an overwhelming majority of them are already connected into care and are already virally suppressed. So we're wasting time and wasting resources when we should be fighting against systemic racism and oppression in our medical and public health systems.
%. All righty. So the next one I have is for Barb, and it kind of goes along with the question that was just dropped in the chat. So, okay, but folks say, okay, but what's our alternative? Like, what do we have in order to track or to end the epidemic, to lead to an ending, if we don't have MHS? Because this program is so great.
Yeah, I mean, I would point again to what Amir has said about how long it takes for them to actually get the cluster detection responses back. That by then, if the state health department is doing their job and have appropriate people who are reaching out to folks who are newly diagnosed, that we already have those folks. We've already connected those folks to care. We've already provided them those resources by the time the cluster happens and it comes back and things like that. So we have tried really hard at the federal level to have a moratorium on molecular HIV surveillance. And we have a wonderful partnership with Barb,
you muted.
You muted again, Barb.
I know, I'm not sure why it is doing that. It's lost its mind. We have a great, can you hear me now? Okay, great. So we have a wonderful partnership with PACHA, which is the President's Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, that has looked at molecular HIV surveillance, has actually really listened to community and our concerns about how the state is being used, how this program was developed without input by people living with HIV. And I put the link in, and I would recommend that people go and look at it, because really what we're talking about is people being informed that their information is being gathered this way, people having the right to actually opt out of having their information shared, and ensuring that there are protections around your data so that it isn't in these states. I believe they came up with a red light, green light, yellow light sort of indications about how protected your data is. So in these states where law enforcement can actually access people's information, that is not a state where people are having their molecular HIV information gathered, because they can't guarantee that our data is going to be protected. And so when we talk about what we can push back on, what we can do is at the state level, we can start pushing back on our state health departments, and we can ask them, how are you protecting my data? How are you ensuring that it's not going to be used in any sort of criminalization case, that it's not going to be shared with other states who have laws that criminalize people living with HIV, that people living with HIV are aware that their information has been gathered and has been shared in this way, and that people can opt out. So those are the ways that we go ahead and continue to try and say, we might not be able to stop it at a federal level, but we certainly can make sure that people are aware and protected. We can remove this patronizing kind of like, well, if we share the information, that if we share with people living with HIV that their information is being gathered and transmitted to the CDC and used in this kind of mapping response, that they'll stop coming into care. That's patriarchal. I need to be able to determine how my information is being shared and how it's not being shared. And until you can actually guarantee that there are protections in place and that people know about it, you shouldn't have information like this. It shouldn't be shared. It again goes back to this patronizing determination around people living with HIV are less than, our rights are less than, and I refuse to accept that.
Barb, that's 100%. Like I heard recently from Mandisa at the CDC's Black Women convening, when I brought up MHS, because nobody else in the space did, and I brought it up, and Mandisa was like backing me up in this process. But the one thing that she said that stuck out to me was it's the opposite of what they said, as far as we can't have informed consent. Rather, by having informed consent, you will have a better turnout of people living with HIV, a better involvement in care, because you are actually consulting and working with the people who are making the decisions. Like, it's our life, it's our care. Before we move to the next question, I see Jessica's hand, so I'm gonna let Jessica go ahead.
Quick question. I moved from Mississippi. I am right at 25 years positive. When I moved here to Texas, the facility that I went to get getting care here, they had to have shared my information with the health department, because the health department here contacted me. Does the health department here also benefit from my DNA? Because I'm already, I've been positive for right at 25 years. So what was the purpose, do you guys know, for them sharing my my information here in Texas? Or does it have anything to do with this? Does anybody know?
Jessica, that's a really specific question, and I'm not sure if we do know, but we can certainly check it out and get back to you.
Okay, thanks, Barr.
I see Michael Scars. I see your hand.
Yeah, hey. I just wanted to say that here in San Francisco, for example, on an annual basis, the San Francisco Department of Public Health uses a consumer database called LexisNexis, and they actually look up and track the address of every single person living with HIV in the city and county of San Francisco. So they know where we are, they know where to find us. That happens like every single year. And so, and when they love to talk about that when they apply for grants and things, they talk about how robust their data system is, that it makes them more efficient. It gives them a competitive advantage when they're competing for grant funding with other cities and areas. And I kind of think of your question as just being very much a part of the larger surveillance machinery that has become the norm for HIV and public health today. So that's it.
Thank you, Michael, for providing that insight. That helped me understand, because it came up on our last state lead called as far as the different types of surveillance and the ways that we are being surveilled. And it just opened my eyes when folks started bringing up like surveillance when you're applying for government assistance, or surveillance in like just different settings, because it's not just MHS. It happens so often. Tana, go ahead, Tana. But then we're gonna get into the questions from you all.
So, when I think about the surveillance, and I think about the surveillance of MHS, this is one of the reasons why people are not getting tested. They don't want to get tested because of a lot of the issues that come along with surveillance. And I'm going to use this one as an example of surveillance, TB, because I had TB. And the surveillance around TB is sort of the same issues a little bit, but it's a different type of, because people can be criminalized for TB also. But when I think about why are you targeting marginalized communities, Black folks, Latinx folks, Asian folks, why are you just targeting us? We're not doing anything different. So for me, the fight is, this shouldn't be done, because I live in Texas and we fought really hard. And I have to say, the health department did not listen to us. They do not listen to the people that's most impacted by this. So for me, I will never stop fighting. I will keep bringing it up. And it's important that we really understand what this is going to do to our communities.
Tana, your point actually led us right into our next question. You brought up TB, a communicable disease, and I saw Alicia Cookie in the chat. Like, it's as if we're being tagged, like we're whales, and then put back out in the wild, but monitored. They're monitoring us. So it's all surveillance. So the first question is, does this also apply for other illnesses, which I hear a lot? For example, COVID, chickenpox, other STIs, TB, like Tana just mentioned, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis is one that I know is heavily surveilled here in Georgia. So does this molecular HIV surveillance apply to that? And anybody on the panel can answer.
Yeah, and I think I saw that questions from Deirdre, and I think Deirdre asked it when we were talking about, if I remember correctly, we were talking about state laws protecting the confidentiality of your medical information. So I'm not sure if, Deirdre, you meant whether the authorized release of your data, whether that we're also talking about other like STIs and stigmatized diseases. But it is my understanding that, yeah, this kind of like molecular epidemiology or molecular analysis is used for many, tracking many illnesses and diseases. But Deirdre, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thank you for answering this. This is whether I know the answer or not, this is just for other people in the room. So I know some people will be like, well, as DJ, I'm always poking the bear. But no, this is for all of that above, because we know when we had this amazing pandemic that happened, they were doing the same and similar. We're tracking, I know, epidemiology. That's like the basis of all of that amazing stuff is tracking. And I think I'm going to mess up the person's name, but the person from San Francisco who brought it up about, tracking these numbers does help. I mean, now please listen to my words. Not saying I'm supporting, but that it does in essence, like if they have a robust set of numbers, just like any one of us that would apply for a grant, if you have, the more information you have, the better likelihood that you will be in order to get said grant. Unfortunately, it happens to be on the back of our health information, unfortunately. So yeah, it is a question for one. I know not all states do participate in giving out, for the health department, giving out that information, inclusive of HIV and other illnesses. But I also know that if you come up with the chickenpox, there is a record of your having chickenpox in some way, and they're able to then go in and unfortunately, again, not saying I agree with it, but able to go in and say, oh, we have a breakout or outbreak in this particular area, and so we have to do a rapid response in those areas. I can use Danville, Virginia as an example. One point we had eradicated syphilis, and years ago, as you know, syphilis has come back on the rise and in full force. And because of the information that the health department got, and it wasn't necessarily that, I'll use my name, Deidre has had syphilis and is transmitting to other people, but has noticed a rise in the numbers that the doctors were reporting. So they were able to get in, do their task force amazingness, and trying to get people tested, treated, and all that extra stuff. So just want other people on the call to know that, yes, this is specifically because we're talking HIV, but this does apply. And if not, please correct me. This does apply to other things. And then how that applies to other things is going to be different. Unfortunately, yes, Cookie, sometimes we are tagged, booted, and tooted and sent out to the wild, and they're watching us like experiments to see what the heck we all got going on in some aspects of this life. But I just wanted other people to know that HIV surveillance is not just the only thing in how it can impact our daily lives. And then I also want to mention, again, I've made a comment in the chat, please, I'm poking the bear, but not poking the bear, and you all aren't the bear. The feds are the bear. In the sense of, that there are a lot of policies that are out here right now where people are, are really hesitant to even get treatment on things because of this. But then also, there are some pressing things. I know a lot of women in this space that, finances is one, food is one, housing is one, job security, 50 gazillion billion other things as well. And not to say that this is not an important topic, but those sometimes can be our priorities when we are, as state leads, sometimes speaking to individuals, and to them they say, oh, great, that's amazing, but can you help me get into an apartment next week? And how to really put more traction into those versus some of the policy things, because just like this policy thing, those are people that have needs too. And I'll end there and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Deidre. Continue to poke the bear. I be endorsing all the shits. Melanie, I see your hand.
Yes, I wanted to state that I'm on the Maryland Coalition to Decriminalize HIV, and we keep putting bills forward to repeal the bill, and we keep meeting up with a Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault, wanting to put amendments in to derail the repealing of the bill. But the last amendment was take out HIV and put in all communicable diseases. And when that played out and they found out that that included anything that's communicable, COVID, flu, the whole gamut, that ended that amendment, because that's everybody could be prosecuted with communicable disease. And also, Maryland is a state that does not require a subpoena to get records from the health department. And we have an uptick in babies born with HIV or discovered when they're 5 or 6 years old that they were born with HIV, and congenital syphilis. The State Department, okay, we've got to get this. We used to be at 0, blah, blah, blah. So they put in the GIFT Act. That is giving infants a life free from transmission, which requires all pregnant people to register at the health department, or their providers have to register them, and then they are followed to make sure they do not deliver babies who are positive or have congenital syphilis. They felt that that's the way to put it in to this uptick, not putting all the onus on the pregnant person. Why aren't they in care? Hey, they may be trafficked. They may be a sex worker. They're trying to hide it from their pimp, or if that still exists. They may be in an abusive relationship, or it might have been an incestual relationship, and so they're not going to the doctor. We are not seen as human beings. We are not seen as people. We are not seen as someone who has common sense and can make appropriate decisions. And we are faced often with situations that give us not the opportunity to do what we consider to be the right thing, that we have to avoid the right thing to stay alive. So don't get me started. I can go on for days. Molecular HIV surveillance and criminalization of human beings with a disease is criminal itself.
Preach, Melanie.
Okay, I was just about to say the same thing. Amir, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it to you.
Thank you, Antoinette. And yes, thank you, Melanie. That was incredible. And I just wanted to touch on something that Deirdre mentioned, right? That syphilis and congenital syphilis cases, and Deirdre talked rightfully about people's hesitancy accessing care. And I actually think this example is a really important one that touches on the community concerns around molecular HIV surveillance and its links with criminalization. Because You have a lot of public health and medical folks right now rightfully alarmed at the increase, right? Just like Deirdre said, the United States, we had virtually eliminated syphilis at the turn of the millennium, and cases are going up. However, there's just been no analysis from a lot of public health and medical folks on criminalization being an underlying factor here, right? Because Deirdre talked about people's hesitancy connecting to testing and care and treatment. And in the cases of congenital syphilis, it's obvious that pregnant people are really afraid about how substance use testing that's forced on pregnant people the results of that substance use testing can be weaponized against them. And I just want to give like a quick shout out to Pregnancy Justice. It's this incredible organization. They've identified, here's a really just good example of the increase in criminalization targeting pregnant people in the United States over the last few generations, which really gets to this issue that Deirdre was talking about hesitancy and mistrust in accessing care, right? Since Roe v. Wade in 1973, Pregnancy Justice found 1,700 instances in the country in which women and pregnant people were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted, detained, or forced to undergo medical interventions because of substance use screening, right? But here's the important part I wanted to highlight, and then I'll stop because I know we're a little bit over time. Between 1973 and 2005, there were 413 of those arrests or prosecutions or criminalizations, right? But between 2006 and 2020, there were 1,300 of them, right? Many, many more pregnant people have made contact with the criminal legal system because of forced substance use testing since 2006 than they did between 1973 and 2005. So this is an important part of something that animates our concerns and our fears around molecular HIV surveillance. And I think it gets exactly to the point that Deirdre was making. And yeah, with that, I'll stop because I know we're over time.
Amir, thank you for sharing that information. My mouth was on the floor. And I definitely typed in Pregnancy Justice Organization because I'm going to look into them. So we are at time. If folks have additional questions that they did not hear asked or answered, please put them in the chat so that we can make sure to capture them in the notes, because this is not the end of this conversation. We still have one more, I don't want to say episode, but one more training, a part of this series, and we can come back to the questions that we did not answer today. One of my questions that I see, one of the questions I see here is like, what is the plan other than ending MHS? So what are our suggestions or next steps? What are the recommendations for when MHS is abolished? Like, where do we go from there? And I know we don't have time today, but this is something that we can definitely talk about in our next training series. So next, join us on August 27th for the last part of our series. You can register using the Mobilize link that you use to register for this one. It'll send you a notification for the next one. So we hope that you all can come back and join us in this conversation. If you do have other questions, please email them to us if you didn't get the opportunity to ask it in the chat, because we will definitely add it to the questions for the next conversation. Here's the contact information from everyone that you heard from today. Melanie, contact isn't in there, but Melanie, please drop your contact information in the chat. Folks use Melanie as a resource. As you heard, she is very, very knowledgeable about MHS and the way that she advocates, and having that one-on-one conversation with the state lead, with the actual member of PWN, can really help support your movement work and your advocacy. So definitely connect with Melanie. She's always open. I don't want to say always available for folks, but she's always open when I need her and when other folks need her. So we love you, Melanie. Thank you, Amir, for being here. Thank you, Barb, for providing your insight, your expertise. You all did an amazing, amazing job. I learned so much just being in this space, and I hope everyone else did as well. And with that, you all can be well. I'm sending you on your way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annette. This was really good.
Miss Jessie, real quick, you didn't, I know your hand was raised multiple times. I do at least want to allow you to.
No, that's okay. I got it. It was answered. I was under a different name. Sorry about that. You guys did a great job, Barb, Melanie, and answering that beautiful presentation. A lot of information that we never had.
Thank
and
you.
what do? Perish for lack of knowledge.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It
See
was
you
a great
guys soon. Take care.